All right, so it's really a pleasure to be here to speak to you today at the opening of our new center, and it's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with such dedicated people over the past, I think, year and a half. I'd like to thank the previous speakers, wherever they are right now, for presenting excellent work on the economics of human development and the capacity for public policy to augment that development. But how exactly do we use our knowledge of human development and data covering the course of that development for prediction? We're going to try to answer that question in the project Forecasting with Panel Data over the Life course. The ultimate goal is to be able to predict the later life outcomes of individuals using only information from infancy through adolescence. So before I show you our progress to date, I'd first like to motivate very quickly the project from a policy standpoint. So there are a bunch of publicly provided early education and intervention programs out there. Maria spoke to you earlier about the Nurse-Family Partnership, and there's Head Start, Early Head Start, and even Obama's latest proposal for expanding access to pre-K education. But all these programs compete for funding with each other and with anything else within the government's discretionary budget. So how do we justify spending, for example, $5.2 billion per year on the Child Care and Development Fund versus $8 billion on Head Start or $16.5 billion on technical assistance for needy families? Well, hopefully in some way, the funding dedicated to these programs is tied to the benefits they create relative to costs. But calculating the benefits of early childhood programs, which alter a lifetime of experiences, decisions, of income, health, requires detailed data over many years over the lifetime and possibly even more. As Stefano mentioned earlier, there are, however, linking these early childhood measures, which would require only data in their early period of life, with later life outcomes. And the literature in human development establishes links, for example, between the in utero environment, early nutrition, and birth weight on future adult health and earnings. Or externalizing behavior and academic motivation with future employment or criminal activity. Or classroom quality during the school-age years to future earnings. But how do we apply these lessons in order to build a formal strategy for prediction? So we'd like to develop a strategy which is going to allow us to qualify the accuracy of our forecasts and to address uncertainty in the forecast model. So just to briefly outline what we're going to do, I created this nice diagram, hopefully you enjoy it, of two data sets. The data set on the left is going to represent a long-run panel data set, which is going to include, for example, measures at age 2, 3, and 4 of some childhood skills and some measures of the home environment. This is just to illustrate. And then at age 40, it's going to have a measure of adult earnings. Then we have a short-run data set. Here I have the example of the Head Start impact study data, which is going to include some of the same measures in those early years, but some of the data is going to be missing. But it does not have any measure later on in life at age 40 because the children right now are only 13 to 14 years old. So what we want to do is we want to first compare the data, and this is it takes quite a bit of time. Andres and I have been spending a lot of time on this. Oh, I should have mentioned, this is a project with Andres Hajman. Sorry that my nerves got to me and I forgot my buddy here. And we're going to establish there's going to be a relationship between the measures that we have overlapping between the two data sets and adult earnings in the long run panel data. And we're going to use that in order to help predict the adult earnings in this short run data set. So before we proceed to prediction, however, we'd first like to validate some facts by using existing long-run panel data sets. We can do this in two ways. We can first validate some basic relationships across the data. And this is in some way going to qualify forecasts that have already been made that were very simple in nature as far as just taking standard deviations of a skill and corresponding that to future earnings and making a prediction that way. So we can qualify those predictions. And then we'd like to do something a little more complicated, and that's something that we hope to do in the next coming weeks, and that will be actually forecasting using a more extensive model and then comparing among these long-run data sets and see how well we do. So today we're just going to focus on the first, validating some basic relationships here. So we're going to use 3 long-run panel data sets. And as I've already mentioned, the Perry Preschool study, and you've seen it mentioned earlier, and I'm sure you're all familiar with. Then we're also going to use data from the Carolina Abecedarian Project, and also a subsample from the CNLSY. We're going to further restrict, that subsample is going to be restricted to just black children with family incomes below $40,000, just to get some measure, just to in some way make them comparable, more comparable to the other 2 long-run panel data sets. In order to, this exercise is going to be rather simple. We're first going to have just a univariate regression of an outcome on a specific childhood measure from a specific age. And then we're, in the second specification, our multivariate specification, we're going to then include some background characteristics, such as mother's education, the family income, gender, whether or not the father is home, and number of siblings in the home as well. Once we estimate the coefficients of this regression, which is simple enough, we're going to plot the R-squared in the case of the univariate regression, and then we're going to plot the partial R-squared in the case of the multivariate regression associated with the childhood measure that we're interested in through ages 2 through 15. So in other words, we're going to plot the explanatory power of a childhood measure as the child develops. The predictors that we're going to focus on today, though we looked at an expanded set, are conscientiousness, IQ, and home stimulation. We compute factor scores for conscientiousness and home stimulation. For conscientiousness, we use items associated with task orientation, thoroughness, focus, planning. For IQ, we use measures of the Stanford-Binet in the Abecedarian and the Perry data. And then due to a lack of a pure measure of IQ, we're using the PPVT in the CNLSY. To measure home stimulation, we're going to use items from the inventory of the home environment. These are going to include items related to learning activities in the home, communication between the mother and the father and the child, reading, the amount of either the frequency of reading to the child, and learning materials in the home. So as I proceed to show you these plots of explanatory power over ages 2 through 15, I'm first going to show you the explanatory power for highest grade completed or educational attainment. Then I'm going to move to adult income, and finally to the number of felonies committed. So just the next 9 plots are going to look like this, so let's make sure you know what you're seeing. At the very top, you're going to see the particular childhood measure that we're interested in this case, a measure of conscientiousness. And on the right, you're going to see the outcome that we're trying to explain. On the top left there, you're going to see the specification we're using. So again, in the univariate case, we're not conditioning on background characteristics. And then on the y-axis is going to represent the explanatory power, either R-squared or partial R-squared. And then we're going to show the explanatory power from ages 2 through 15. So let's go ahead and begin, and we'll look at conscientiousness and highest grade completed. Just to gauge kind of the explanatory power, what is a threshold for a good explainer of these outcomes? So I'd say anywhere between 5 to 10% and higher is going to be fairly predictive of these outcomes. Because keep in mind, it's only a simple linear regression. As you can see, conscientiousness seems to be a pretty strong predictor, more so maybe in the later years, but the pattern isn't exactly so clear as to if the explanatory power is increasing over time. After we move to the multivariate specification, you can see that after we condition on some background characteristics that the explanatory power drops pretty significantly. However, it's somewhat difficult to interpret this as if we really want to know the association between conscientiousness and highest grade completed, it's possible that some of these background characteristics are flowing into the production function for conscientiousness, in which case the univariate graph would perhaps be a better indication of the explanatory power of conscientiousness for highest grade completed. On the other hand, if these background characteristics also impact highest grade completed but are also correlated with conscientiousness, then the multivariate graph might be a better indicator of the association or explanatory power of conscientiousness. Now we move to IQ, and I think this graph is actually pretty astounding. You can see that we're explaining up to 30% in just this univariate specification, at least in the Perry data and also in the CENLSY, but keep in mind this is the PPVT. And then this explanatory power does not exactly change too much after we condition on these background characteristics. Now you'll see that there's a general increase in explanatory power over time, and that you could explain this in a number of ways, but two possible ways you might explain this increase in explanatory power is that perhaps academic motivation is somehow correlated with our measure of IQ, and that's something that will manifest as the child ages, in which case the explanatory power might increase over time. Another reason is that perhaps these measures of IQ are just not very good for a young child, and therefore the explanatory power early on is going to reflect some attenuation bias. Now we'll move to the explanatory power of home stimulation for highest grade completed. In both the CENLSY, it seems to be a moderately good explainer of some of the variation in educational attainment. One interesting thing I'd like like you to notice for home stimulation is that, as opposed to IQ or measures of skills, that each different age that you see these measurements at can really mean something about the timing of investments. We should be thinking about the timing of investments for the ability to make an impact if we are to make causal statements on educational attainment. But just as for conscientiousness, the explanatory power is going to drop after we condition on background characteristics, but which might again not be a surprise if we think that the amount you read to your child is in some way associated with, as we mentioned earlier in the earlier talks, your capacity to read to your child or your affinity to, if you are, for instance, higher educated. Now we'll move to the second income, or the second outcome that we're interested in, and we're going to investigate adult income. So here we plotted the explanatory power of conscientiousness for adult income, and you can see it's significantly lower than what you saw earlier for educational attainment, and the picture changes somewhat, but still low explanatory power except for this blip for ABC at age 5. Now, one reason why we might not be able to explain, well, I'm sure you could guess many reasons why this simple linear model is not able to explain much of the variance in adult income, and we're just simply not capturing anything related to a work decision. Perhaps if we had a measure of the latent wage or a more permanent measure of income, we could explain more of the variance in this outcome. Now we're going to move to IQ. You can see that the explanatory power of IQ for adult income seems to be fairly consistent across, at least in this univariate specification, across the data sets that we have. In fact, almost converging over in the 8, 9, and 10 and 12 year range to something around 10% of the variance. But the picture gets a little inconsistent after we begin conditioning on some background characteristics here. But still remains relatively high for the Perry data. In general, now we move to home stimulation and adult income, and we have if you're taking these numbers as not a data fluke over time, we could have two competing stories to explain that. Keep in mind that there is a 10% explanation of the variance for adult income, or near 10% at age 2 in the CNLSY, and a rising explanatory power for Abecedarian over time. The two competing stories that you could have is perhaps that that in the CNLSY, we're just capturing a very important window for investment, in that when the parent happens to be spending more time with their child at this early age, they can just have a better impact on their future earnings. In Abecedarian, we could possibly see just that perhaps home investments are in some way complementary to public investments as the child enters school age and possibly preschool. And the implications don't change too much after we condition on these background characteristics here. We'll move to our final outcome here. We're going to investigate the explanatory power for these predictors of felony arrests. And we're not going to ever explain felonies very well in the CNLSY, and this could just be due to the specific nature of these samples, the Perry and Abecedarian data being located in a specific geographic region. Perhaps there's something we're not capturing here. But overall, we are going to predict or explain, felonies fairly well in the Abecedarian and Perry data, at least at a few ages, although the picture isn't consistent exactly over time. And again, the implications do not change after we condition on background characteristics. When we move to the explanatory power of IQ for felonies, we're going to notice that that IQ is only associated with number of felonies committed in the Perry data, and the implications do not change too much after we condition on these background characteristics here. And finally, we move on to our last relationship here between home stimulation and felonies. The implications don't change too much. All we see is that this hike in explanatory power at age 4, the number of felonies committed. And again, because we're looking at certain periods of development here, it's possible that this could be informative in some way, especially if we had some consistency across the data, but we don't. So what are the implications for forecasting, and what does this say about previous attempts at forecasting using only these very simple models? And that's because these data sets aren't painting a very consistent picture with these simple linear regressions, that any study that's simply using a difference in standard deviations associated with future adult incomes might not really be predicting. We wouldn't have much confidence in those predictions. As you saw in the plots, in some cases we had some monotonic increases in explanatory power over age, and as we proceed to forecasting, that might aid our selection of these predictors in terms of, well, we'll just use the latest measure of IQ because it seems to be fairly predictive of educational attainment, although the dynamics of this IQ growth might still be very relevant for prediction as we proceed. I already mentioned the consistency across data sets and what this might mean for very simple methods of forecasting, but the good news is that because we are using multiple data sets and plan to incorporate more panel data sets in the future, that perhaps we can be a little bit more confident or at least qualify the accuracy of these forecasts a little bit better than anything else previously done. We've also seen that there's been a cost to the simplicity of these models. We weren't able to capture the nuances that underlie the data which form your future earnings. However, we may yet hope to capture these with a richer multivariate specification, or perhaps a more economic model if we get to that stage. We also have, as you saw, we just have many viable predictors, and there could be an extreme number of forecast models available to us. So the selection of that model is going to add to the uncertainty of our forecasts. So as we take our next steps to forecasting, we'd like to employ some methods to address this uncertainty, and this could either, for the selection of regressors, use some sort of a model averaging technique, which we've already begun writing some code for in order to employ this and employ it quickly. And then also, if we're worried about the exact functional form that we're using, we can use some form of matching procedure, which might provide an intuitive way to incorporate all the information from all the data sets. Combining the forecasts of the linear models across the 3 different data sets is something that we need to investigate further. And then we'd like to go ahead and try to predict the impact of an intervention such as Head Start. And in the future, we'd like to incorporate more long-run paddle data sets as they become available. And if we can, in some way really incorporate the panel nature of the data and the dynamics of growth for prediction. Thank you.